You know they say a house is built of bricks and beams but a home is made of hopes and dreams, and let me tell you, there isn't a heart in this world that doesn't break a little when they see those dreams tossed out into the dirt like yesterday's newspapers. I had just finished driving my wife Elena back from her physical therapy session, and when we pulled into the driveway the first thing I saw was her suitcase sitting right in the middle of the yard. Clothes were scattered all across the grass baking under that brutal midday sun while they just lay there in the heat. My daughter-in-law Vanessa was standing up on the front porch sipping on a latte, and she looked me right in the eye and said the word trash in a voice that was flat and cold as a stone. Elena squeezed my hand so hard I thought her fingers might snap, and I could feel her shaking from her head down to her toes. This was the house she had poured her life into for 30 long years, and I just sat there in the car without moving a muscle because I understood the whole ugly picture immediately. The person who hadn't built a single thing was now deciding who was worthy of staying, and that was the exact moment I decided to stop being silent. Before I go any further, if you are listening to this story somewhere, do me a favor and leave a comment down below and subscribe to the channel, because a simple like or a share gives me a reason to tell you every single thing that happened after that moment. Now let me take you back to that afternoon when everything really started. I stayed perfectly still in the car for a few more seconds, just long enough to realize that if I opened that door right then my whole life was going to go in a completely different direction. Elena was still clutching my hand, and it felt so much thinner since she had gotten sick. It was cold and trembling, just a bit like she was trying to apologize for even being there. I was used to keeping my cool on a judge's bench for over 30 years, but in that moment I had to call on every bit of discipline I ever learned just to keep my anger from boiling over. Before I could act, I looked through the windshield and watched my own yard turn into something I didn't recognize anymore. Elena's brown leather suitcase, the one she had carried since we were first married, was tipped over on its side under the big oak tree. The lock had popped open and one of her old sweaters was flapping in the wind, catching that red Georgia dust. Her old sewing machine was sitting there crooked in the dirt, the same one I gave her for our 15th anniversary, and it looked like something that just didn't matter anymore. That was when the bitter truth really settled into my bones, that the things tied to a whole lifetime of memories were being treated like scraps in the very house those sacrifices had built. Vanessa was still on the porch with the sunlight flashing off her expensive sunglasses, and she wasn't even looking at us. She was just talking to two cleaning guys in a flat voice like she was reading a grocery list. When Elena finally opened the car door, the sound of the gravel crunching made Vanessa turn around, and her eyes slid right over Elena and stopped at the walker sitting behind the seat. There wasn't any surprise in her look, just a decision that had already been made. I heard her comment clear as a bell, even though she said it as light as a breeze, just a cold remark about how old junk didn't fit the new look she wanted. I spent 30 years as a judge, so I know when a sentence is meant to end a discussion, and that was exactly what she was doing. Elena just lowered her head and she didn't even cry, which hurt me worse than anything. She just bent down to pick up a scarf that had fallen out of the bag, moving slow like she was scared of bothering someone. I finally stepped out of the car and stood there in the middle of the yard, and that Savannah summer sun showed absolutely no mercy. It stripped everything bare, including my silence. Vanessa started trying to explain herself, but she wasn't talking to me. She spoke like she was presenting a plan that had already been approved, saying the east bedroom needed to be refreshed and all the old furniture had to go because guests were coming and they needed a clean space. The second I heard the word guests, I understood everything she wasn't saying. In her mind, this house wasn't a home anymore, it was just a tool. My son Marcus wasn't out on the porch, which didn't surprise me because he always had a way of disappearing when things got uncomfortable. I looked up at the window of his study and saw the curtains pulled tight, and I wondered if he could hear us, or if he had just learned how to ignore it all. One of the cleaners hesitated when he saw me standing there, and he looked at Vanessa and then at Elena and just stopped. I held up my hand for him to pause, not because I wanted to start a fight but because I just needed a moment to think. Vanessa frowned because she clearly wasn't used to anyone interrupting her rhythm. I bent down and picked up that sewing machine, and it felt a lot heavier than I remembered, maybe because of all the memory clinging to it. Elena put her hand on my arm real light and whispered that it was fine and that she could stay anywhere she needed to. Hearing a woman who once ran this entire household talk about shrinking herself down just to avoid trouble made something crack inside of me. I looked at Vanessa carefully for the first time, not as her father-in-law but as a man trained to read people in a matter of minutes, and I saw the confidence of someone who thought she held all the power, and I saw how much she was in a hurry. She wanted this done fast before anyone could start asking questions. I didn't say a single thing, I just nodded like I was going along with the plan, and that made her relax enough to go back to her phone, probably calling up some decorator. I helped Elena gather up her things one item at a time, moving slow and careful like I was closing out a long case file, and when everything was in the car. I shut the trunk and that metal sound felt dry and final. I turned to Vanessa and told her we would just stay in the guest house for a few days to get some rest, and she nodded her head immediately without even trying to hide how happy she was to have us out of the way. That easy decision confirmed my suspicion that this wasn't just a random idea but a step in a bigger plan. As I drove toward the back of the property, those old oak trees slid past the windows, and they had been standing there a lot longer than I had, watching generations come and go, and I wondered when people started believing they could just erase a whole lifetime with a couple of short commands. The guest house was hot and damp with no air conditioning to speak of, and Elena sat down in a wooden chair, breathing heavy, while I brought her some water and set that sewing machine down beside her like a quiet promise. I told her it was only temporary, but I could tell she didn't really believe me. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I just sat by the window listening to the bugs and the wind moving through the garden, and in that silence I reorganized everything in my mind, not for the sake of revenge but to put an end to a mess that had gone too far. I had been quiet long enough, and I understood that by tomorrow silence wasn't going to be an option anymore. The next morning the heat in that guest house rose faster than I expected, and the air felt thick, like you needed permission to take a breath. Elena woke up early and was quietly folding that scarf from the day before with so much care it made my heart ache. She didn't complain, and that silence was the clearest sign I had that a boundary had been crossed. I told Elena I was heading into the main house to grab some old papers, and I spoke slow and gentle so she wouldn't think I was looking for trouble. She looked at me for a long time and then she just nodded, and I could tell it wasn't resistance, it was just the tired trust of a woman who had handed the rest of herself over to me. I walked through the oak garden and stepped through the side door of the main house. It is a funny thing how the people you think you know the best can turn into complete strangers the moment a little bit of money is on the table, and sometimes you have to lose everything you ever cared about just to find the strength to stand up and take it all back. Nobody tried to block my path or ask what I was doing when I walked back into that house, because I guess they figured I had finally learned my place and wasn't going to be a problem anymore. I headed straight up the stairs and stopped right in front of the door to my son Marcus' office, which was cracked open just a tiny bit. I gave it a soft little tap just to keep up appearances in case anyone was watching, but I didn't get an answer. When I stepped inside, the whole room was perfectly tidy and in order, which felt like a slap in the face compared to the mess they had made of our lives out in the yard the day before. I shut that door behind me and stood there for a few seconds holding my breath just to make sure the coast was clear before I started looking around. I didn't just tear the place apart, but I went right for the drawers I knew my son used for his most important documents, since I was the one who taught him how to keep his files organized back when he was just a student, and those kinds of habits don't just disappear over time. In that second drawer, tucked away under a big stack of building sketches, I found a plain white envelope with my wife Elena's name printed on the front, but I could tell right away the handwriting wasn't hers. Inside was a copy of a mortgage loan agreement, and those numbers on the page were clear and cold as ice. I took my time reading every single line, from the names on the account to the reason for the loan, and then I saw the signature at the bottom. I recognized it immediately, not because it looked like hers but because it looked like someone was trying way too hard to make it look real. Elena never signed her name in one smooth motion like that, because she always had this little hitch at the end of the last letter, like she was checking to see if she was still there, but this signature was just a fast and hollow imitation. I set that paper down on the desk and took a deep breath, and I didn't feel dizzy or lightheaded. I just felt empty, like a part of me had been holding on to a tiny bit of hope that this was all just a misunderstanding or a bit of temporary arrogance. But that paper erased every bit of that hope. This wasn't just about a bad attitude anymore, it was a cold and calculated plan that was already several steps down the road. I kept digging through the folders and found some printed emails talking about a chain of spas that was drowning in debt, with all these highlighted promises and ugly numbers that didn't add up. And that is when I finally understood why our home had suddenly become so valuable to them. It wasn't a place for a family to live anymore, it was just collateral to pay off their mistakes. I heard footsteps coming down the hallway, so I folded those papers up and slid them into my jacket pocket right before Marcus appeared in the doorway looking real tense. He asked me what I was up to, and I just told him I was hunting for some old files I used to keep, but he couldn't even look me in the eye. He just let his gaze sweep across the desk, and I saw him look for a second at my pocket where I had hidden the truth. We sat down together, and I didn't start with any accusations. I just pulled out that loan agreement and slid it across the table toward him and asked one simple question. I wanted to know if his mother had any idea about what was on that paper. Marcus just sat there in a silence that stretched out long enough to tell me everything I needed to know. He finally started talking real quiet, saying that Everything had been calculated out and that they needed the money to get things moving and that the house was just too big for two old people like us anyway. He even had the nerve to claim that Elena had agreed to it all but had probably just forgotten. I listened to every single word he said without saying a thing because I wanted him to hear just how crazy his own explanation sounded, but that moment never came, and when I told him, point blank, that the signature was a fake, Marcus just lowered his head and didn't even try to deny it. He told me that Vanessa was real persuasive and that everything was going to be fine once the project succeeded and that we would all benefit in the long run, and that was the moment I realized my son had handed over his soul to someone else and called it a choice. I stood up and told him I needed some space to think, and he didn't even try to stop me because he looked relieved that the talk was over, and that look of relief told me he had chosen the easy way out a long time ago. I went back to the guest house and gave Elena her medicine and sat down across from her without showing her the paper right away. I just asked her if she had signed anything lately, and she just shook her head looking real confused. But when I put that agreement in front of her, she just stared at it for the longest time and her hands started to shake, not because she was scared but because she finally realized she had been cut out of her own life. She didn't cry, but she just said she had been trying her best not to bother anyone, and that sentence made me realize how our own silence had given these people the room to step in and take over. That evening I sat by myself and I didn't call up a lawyer or rush into a fight. I just started moving the pieces around in my head: the house, the contract, and that big party Vanessa had mentioned on the phone the day before, and everything started to line up into one clear path. I knew that if I acted right then they would just call me emotional and ignore me, so I had to wait for the perfect moment where everything would be exposed under a light they had built for themselves. And when I thought about our living room, the place where Elena used to welcome all our old friends, I knew exactly where my silence was going to end. The party was set for the weekend and Vanessa called it an intimate little gathering, but the guest list was a lot longer than I expected, and all these luxury cars started showing up in the late afternoon, lining the driveway. Under the shade of the oaks I stood by the window of that hot guest house watching all those strangers walk into the quiet center of my family's life, and none of them had any idea they were standing on a foundation that had already started to shift. Vanessa told Elena she needed to help out a little bit, and she laid out a simple dress on the bed that was a neutral color and looked more like a uniform than something a person would choose to wear, and Elena just put it on without asking any questions. I saw her hesitate for just a second in the mirror before she turned away, and I didn't step in to stop it, not because I liked what was happening but because I needed the whole scene to play out exactly the way they expected. I showed up late to the house on purpose because I wanted to walk in when the room was already packed to the rafters, and when I opened that living room door the noise died down for a second and I saw faces turn toward me before they quickly looked away. I recognized a few people we used to know years ago who had sat at our table, and their eyes lingered on me for a moment before drifting over to Elena, who was standing real quiet near the drinks. Vanessa was right in the middle of the room talking easy with a glass in her hand like she was the queen of the castle, and when she saw me she gave me one of those practiced smiles, but she didn't bother to introduce me and I didn't need her to. Elena bent down to pick up a glass that had dropped near a guest's feet and I saw it clear as day from across the room, and not one person offered to help her. I walked right over and put my hand on her shoulder, and I was gentle but I was firm enough to help her stand up straight. And I told her she didn't have to do that for anyone. Vanessa saw it happen and her eyes got real dark for a second, but then she just turned back to her guests and tapped her glass to get everyone's attention. The whole room went quiet and she started talking about vision and opportunity and a brand new lifestyle, using all those fancy words she had practiced so hard, and I just stood right there behind her listening to every single lie she told. They say a man's home is his castle, but they never tell you what happens when the people you love start trying to tear down the walls while you're still inside. I didn't even give her a glance because I was too busy watching all those heads in the crowd nodding along to every word she said, and right when she got to the peak of her speech where she started talking about how much she loved her supportive family, I took my cue and stepped forward. I didn't rush or make a scene, I just moved in close enough so that everyone would have to notice me, and then I asked if I could share a couple of thoughts of my own. Vanessa went completely still for a second because she knew she couldn't tell me no without making a huge spectacle in front of all her fancy friends. I didn't say a single word about the money or that business deal she was pushing. Instead I spoke about this house and how it had seen generations of our family grow up, and that it was so much More than just some wood and bricks. My voice stayed real level and steady as the whole room went dead silent while I looked around to make sure I had every eye on me. Then I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a little recording device and told the crowd that before I went any further I wanted them to hear something real quick. Vanessa's face scrunched up and she wanted to know what I was playing, so I told her it was just the plain truth and that the truth doesn't ever need a formal introduction. The sound that came out was clear as day and there was no mistaking that it was Vanessa's voice on the tape. She was laughing in a way she never would around company, and it was a private sound she thought would stay hidden forever. Then came that sharp comment she made about how Elena didn't need to be clogging up the stairs now that she wasn't as fast on her feet as she used to be. I kept my eyes on the room instead of looking at my wife, and I saw folks start to trade looks while some of them put their drinks down on the tables. Vanessa lunged forward to try and kill the sound, but I just held up my hand to stop her and told her the clip was short enough and that we had all heard plenty. Already the silence in that room was heavy and Vanessa looked like a fish out of water, opening and closing her mouth before she managed to fake a smile and claim it was all just a big misunderstanding. Because people say things they don't mean when they are stressed out. I just nodded along and said we all have those days, but then I asked her real calm if forging a person's signature on a loan paper was also just a symptom of being stressed. That question hit the floor like a lead weight, and even though I didn't point any fingers or pull out the papers yet the air went right out of the room. Vanessa spun around to look at Marcus, who was standing by the door, looking like he had just seen a ghost. The secret deal between the two of them was plain for everyone to see now, and I told the room that this whole party was being thrown in a place where the rightful owner had been pushed out of the way. I gestured over to where Elena was standing tall and still, and I said that as far as I was concerned it was time for the show to end. There wasn't any clapping or shouting, but people just started moving toward the door to get their coats, and a few of them stopped to whisper apologies to Elena on their way out. Vanessa just stood there with her jaw locked tight, finally realizing that I was never going to play along with her little game. Once the house started to clear out, I knew that the truth was finally out in the open, and it was the kind of thing you can't unsee once it's been shown. I didn't feel the need to keep talking, so I let the quiet do the work for me, and I walked over to take Elena's hand and lead her out onto the porch. I could hear Vanessa screaming for Marcus behind us, but I didn't even bother to look back because I knew the situation had shifted into a gear they couldn't handle anymore. We walked back to the guest house in total silence, and Elena held on to me tighter than she usually does, and I could tell she was finally starting to breathe easy again, like the weight of that house had been lifted off her shoulders. I watched the lights in the living room go dark one by one as that party ended in the most honest way possible, but I knew I couldn't just stop at embarrassing them, because as much as public exposure helped, it was only the first step. So that night, while Elena was sleeping, I opened up my old leather briefcase and pulled out the legal papers I had spent a lifetime studying, even though I never dreamed I would have to use them against my own flesh and blood. The next day I made some quick calls to verify a few details, and by the time lunch rolled around everything was lined up and ready to go. I told Elena to take it easy and that I had some business to finish up, and she just gave me a nod without asking a single question. I walked back into the main house that afternoon, and the whole place felt heavy with the kind of silence that follows a disaster. Vanessa and Marcus were just sitting there in the living room, and they didn't even bother to get up when I walked in, which was fine by me since they were expecting a talk and I wasn't there to chat. I put my briefcase on the table and laid out the folders in a perfect row while I explained real slow that this house didn't belong to Marcus the way he thought it did, because I had put it into a family trust years ago specifically to protect whoever was living here from making any impulsive mistakes. Vanessa tried to give me a smug little smile and said she had already looked over the papers, so I just nodded and told her she must have missed the part about the conditional use, and I pointed right to the line that said any threat to the safety or dignity of the resident would end their right to live. Their right then and there with no questions asked. Marcus jumped up and told me I couldn't do that, but I looked him square in the eye and told him I wasn't doing anything except enforcing the rules that were already in place. Vanessa started talking a mile a minute about money and investments and how everyone slips up sometimes, but the second she mentioned Elena's name I held up my hand and told her she wasn't allowed to use my wife as an excuse ever again. Then I pulled out the final paper and told them that because of everything that had happened, their right to stay in this house was officially over and that the legal notices were already being processed, so they didn't have days to leave but only hours. Vanessa stood up so fast her chair made a horrible scraping sound on the wood floor, and she started coming at me with her voice getting louder, but I didn't budge an inch because I told her I knew what it was like to feel the world slipping away, but I wasn't going to let her take that out on anyone else. Right then the doorbell rang perfectly on cue, and I opened it to find a professional-looking man who knew me by name and was there just to make sure everything went by the book. Vanessa looked at me and all that confidence she had just melted away into pure panic as she accused me of tearing this family apart, but I just told her that families don't fall apart because of boundaries. They fall apart when nobody has the guts to set any. Marcus just stood there with his arms at his sides and I didn't even feel mad at him anymore. I just felt a deep sadness and I told him that the next move was going to be up to him one day, and then they finally started to pack their bags. You know, I have seen a lot of things in my time on the bench, but nothing quite prepares you for the day your own blood tries to trade your home for a spa franchise, and the one thing they never expect is for the old man in the corner to finally stop being polite and start being a judge again. It wasn't a race, but it wasn't a crawl neither, because the whole house seemed to shift in a strange kind of way. Like it was finally letting out a long breath it had been holding for way too long. I just stood there in the middle of the hallway listening to the sound of those suitcases rolling across the floorboards, and that sound was a whole lot different than the one I heard the day before, because this time around it wasn't just some act for show, but it was the real deal, consequences of their own choices. After that front door finally clicked shut, I stood perfectly still for a little while, not because I wanted to celebrate, but just because I wanted to be absolutely sure I had finished the job I started. I made my way back to the garden where that little guest house was sitting all hot and cramped, and I found Elena sitting right by the window. She stood up the second she saw me coming, and I told her the whole thing was over and done with without going into any of the messy details or giving her some long-winded story. She just looked at me for a good long moment and gave me a nod, and I could see a kind of relief in her eyes that she hadn't let herself feel in a really long time. I walked her back to the main house and opened the door for her to go in. First, because it wasn't about winning some fight, but about her finally coming back home. Right then I understood something as clear as day, that justice doesn't always have to make a lot of noise, and most of the time it is just about putting things back exactly where they ought to be. The rest of that afternoon went by a lot slower than I thought it would, and there weren't any more people running around or whispering on their phones in the corners of the rooms. The house started feeling like itself again, even if things weren't quite the same as before, because while there were a few new empty spots around the place, it felt like a heavy weight had finally been lifted off the rafters. I went around and threw open every single window to let the breeze from the oak trees blow right through the rooms, while Elena just stood there in the center of the living room looking around like she was meeting up with an old friend she hadn't seen in years. I wasn't in any hurry to start fixing things up, since I knew that some wounds just need a little time to heal, so we began with the bedroom on the east side, not because of how it looked but because that was the place where Elena felt the most at peace. I brought in some cleaning folks who were real quiet and got the job done right, and I told them to keep everything exactly where it was and just focus on scrubbing and fixing what was actually broken. Once the bed was back where it belonged, I watched Elena take a deep breath like she was finally setting down a heavy load. She didn't even have a name for that old sewing machine, was beyond saving, and I knew it was junk the second I lifted it out of the dirt, but I still carried it inside and set it right by the window, and I promised Elena I would figure out a way to get it running again, but she just gave me a little smile and shook her head, saying it wasn't really necessary anymore. I went out a few days later and bought a brand new machine that looked just like the old one in the same style and color, and I didn't say a thing but just put it right where the broken one used to sit, and when Elena ran her hand over it and looked at me, that one look said more than any words ever could, because some things in this life just don't need to be explained. The weeks after that went by real quiet, and I made sure the legal paperwork was sent out regarding all those hidden money troubles they were into, but I didn't hover over the process and just left it to the professionals to handle the dirty work. The only thing I really cared about was how the house was slowly finding its old rhythm again, and Elena started hanging out in the garden more often. Every morning she would sit under that big oak tree reading a book or just watching the sun come through the branches. My son Marcus reached out to me one time for a quick phone call where he didn't offer up any kind of apology but just wanted to know if there was still a way back for him, and I told him that you don't get second chances just by talking about them, but you earn them through what you do over a long time. I didn't make him any promises, but I didn't exactly tell him he was gone forever either, because I told him he had to learn how to stand on his own 2 feet before he even thought about coming home. The line just went quiet, and I decided to look at that silence as a tiny little beginning that was fragile, but at least it was real. I never set eyes on Vanessa ever again, because that was a choice I made for myself, and I didn't need another fight about things that were already settled. Whatever was left to deal with was going to be handled the right way, and it wouldn't be fast, but it would be steady, since I have learned over a lifetime that being fair doesn't always feel good. But it gives you a foundation that stops people from falling any further. One day Elena and I were sitting out on the porch in our rocking chairs side by side just like we used to, and I made up a pot of that tea she likes so much. We didn't have much to say, but we just talked a little bit about the weather and what we were planning for the week ahead, because having that simple peace and quiet after all that mess felt like the most valuable thing in the world. When the sun started to go down, that golden light hit the white walls of the house, and Elena leaned back and told me she had been so scared of becoming a burden to everyone. I looked her right in the eye and told her there wasn't a single day in our lives where she was ever a burden to me, and I told her all the years we spent together weren't something that could just be tossed out into the yard just because someone else wanted to change things up. I knew people might talk behind my back and say I was too tough, or that I cared more about the law than my own kin, and I have heard people say things like that plenty of times before, but at my age I know exactly what matters most. I am a husband before I am anything else, and looking out for the woman who has been by my side through everything was never a hard choice to make. When the sun went down over Savannah, the air got real still and I could hear the bugs and the wind blowing through the branches while the house finally felt like it was breathing steady again. I just sat there, not caring about who won or lost, but just thinking about how some lessons don't need any words at all, because you teach those lessons by how you choose to keep on living after the storm has passed. Elena took hold of my hand and it felt a lot warmer than it did the other day. I took one last look at the yard where all those things had been scattered, and now there was nothing but green grass and shade. I knew we would have more troubles down the road, but right then I felt like respect was back where it belonged, and I told Elena I was lucky I stumbled onto that envelope in Marcus' desk exactly when I did. But Elena just gave me a quiet little wink and whispered that she knew I would find it because she was the one who tucked it right where she knew I would look, and that was the moment I realized my wife hadn't been a victim at all. She was just waiting for me to remember who I was. If you stayed with me until this moment, I want to say thank you for listening, and if this story made you think about family and the boundaries that we all have to protect, please subscribe to the channel and like or share this video with someone who needs to hear it, because your support is the reason these stories keep being told, and I appreciate your time.